Dr. Jordan Peterson, one-on-one. He's a clinical psychologist turned culture warrior and one of the world's most famous and infamous intellectuals. His books are instant bestsellers. Tens of millions watch him online. Legions of fans swear by his straight-talking guidance.
What I've recommended to people is clean up your room.
But his outspoken views on issues like feminism,
the taming of the wild man, essentially, by the desirable and virginal woman. And if you think women don't want that, then you better bloody well come up with an explanation for 50 Shades of Grey.
and gender.
You won't use my pronouns, so I'm pretty sure you're my enemy, yes.
Yeah, well, I know you think that, but I don't believe that using your pronouns is going to do you any good in the long run.
Have made him a lightning rod for controversy. Almost 40 million people have now seen this notorious interview with a British news show.
I hope to encourage people. Other than that, I want to see what happens. You know, I want to say what I believe to be true as clearly and carefully as I possibly can. What people don't understand about that, in some sense, is your happiness. The purpose of your life is not going to be happiness. But what you can have in your life is an adventure. You can have an adventure. And the truth is the best adventure. There's no doubt about that. One is, you don't know what's going to happen if you say what you think. Now, I don't mean incautiously, and I don't mean provocatively or any more than necessary. You don't know what's going to happen. So that's very adventurous. But also, if it's you and your voice, then it's your adventure.
And I said, well, why would I apologize for an honestly held opinion? But I was told you, either you apologize or you lose your job.
Yeah.
So I took the losing the job option rather than compromise my free speech idea. Well, because ultimately, I think you've got to be true to yourself. You can't have your own version of the truth, it seemed to me. In a democracy, should it not be my right to listen to you with great respect and then say, I don't believe a word of what you've just said?
And then they're in hell. And sometimes they drag everyone along with them, too. So, yeah, really.
On free speech, it seems to me, in my 57 years of being on this planet, that free speech has never been under more ferocious attack, not in places you would expect, like authoritarian regimes, but actually in democracies. I never thought I'd come to a day in my lifetime where people were literally being fired or in some cases imprisoned for expressing honestly held opinions.
We're having a fight about whether or not your claim that free speech exists is nothing but a masquerade for your willingness to dominate and use power. And so if I was taking that tack, I'd say, it's all well and good for you to speak about free speech, but look, you're white and you're middle class and you're British and you're privileged, and you have this theory about free speech that your ancestors derived, but the only reason they ever derived that to begin with is so they could exercise their power. There's no such thing as free speech. That's just a lie to mask a power claim. And that's a way worse cynical criticism of the notion of free speech than you can't speak because I don't agree with it. I think that young people are literally dying for that message. And I mean literally, they're so demoralized. And so one of the things that's been painful about what I've been doing with my wife as we've traveled around the world for the last number of years is to see how desperate people are for an encouraging word.
I want to know why a lot of young people are very anxious about life. Why is that? I couldn't really get my head around why so many young people feel so anxious all the time, compared to when I was young, when that wasn't really a big thing amongst my friendship group, certainly. But I reckon it's two things. One, social media, the constant bombardment of other people having a great time or looking great, often a false imagery and having to live up to false ideals. Now, it's quite likely that a video of the crocodile eating this person would be whipping its way around social media within half an hour. And young kids will be sharing it, disseminating it, and being exposed to this constant imagery all the time of quite unsettling and shocking imagery.
And the disadvantage is that everything's in your face. And by everything, it might be 40 million pornographic images. But we should also point out that it's no wonder that young people are demoralized and anxious, because we're doing everything we can to demoralize them and make them anxious. Yeah, really.
On free speech, it seems to me, in my 57 years of being on this planet, that free speech has never been under more ferocious attack, not in places you would expect, like authoritarian regimes, but actually in democracies. I never thought I'd come to a day in my lifetime where people were literally being fired or in some cases imprisoned for expressing honestly held opinions, even if I find those opinions grotesquely wrong or offensive.
Yeah, it's worse than that. People underestimate the significance of this because it isn't, we're not having a fight about who has the right to speak freely. That's nothing. That's a peripheral problem, even though that can be serious in and of itself. We're having a fight about whether or not your claim that free speech exists is nothing but a masquerade for your willingness to dominate and use power. And so if I was taking that tack, I'd say, it's all well and good for you to speak about free speech, but look, you're white and you're middle class and you're British and you're privileged, and you have this theory about free speech that your ancestors derived, but the only reason they ever derived that to begin with is so they could exercise their power. There's no such thing as free speech. That's just a lie to mask a power claim. And that's a way worse cynical criticism of the notion of free speech than you can't speak because I don't agree with
I mean, it's a form of fascism, isn't it? I mean, these people...
It's worse than that.
The kind of the ultra woke brigade out there, they categorize themselves as liberals, but there's nothing liberal about that mentality. When you have a cancel culture, which is driven by, if you don't agree with what I say, you're going to get shamed, vilified, cancelled, fired, maybe even imprisoned. That is actually what fascist regimes do to people, to their populace.
Yeah, but the fascists are more straightforward about it because they basically come out and say something like, shut up or we'll beat you.
Right.
Whereas the compassionate types, who are narcissistic compassionate types, they come out and say, well, we're really trying to save the world, and we're acting in everyone's best interest, and we think it would be better if you should just, regulate what you say. Because if you don't, you're not a good person. And so it's much more, on every front we can possibly imagine. We can easily get ourselves in a situation where it's hell this way and hell that way. That's highly probable.
But should the Ukrainians give the Russians anything? When I was over there recently interviewing President Zelensky, what I was struck by was everybody I met in Kyiv, the capital city, were utterly resolute. Don't give them an inch of our land.
Yeah, well, I can't speak to that because I don't know what the preconditions for peace might be. But I do know that naive notions that the Russians are going to lose somehow, or that we're going to win, I just don't understand. I don't understand that. Well, what do you mean we're going to win? What are we going to win here exactly?
Well, I guess a victory would be that the Russians retreated from Ukraine.
With Ukraine in ruins.
Right.
Well,
with
okay, fine. That's a hell of a victory. I think Putin could manage that because I think he could tell his people, and I think they might buy it. It's like, we accomplished our objective.